Welcome to Beyond the Spotlight, a story of secrets, redemption, and the power of starting over. Meet Clarice Moreau, a woman who had it all: wealth, fame, and a thriving empire, until one devastating scandal brought her world crashing down. Fleeing to a quiet coastal village, she trades designer heels for fishing nets, hoping to disappear. But what happens when the ghosts of her past come knocking? And can a life built on lies ever lead to true belonging? Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind the woman the world thought it knew, and the village that might just save her or destroy her. The cameras flashed incessantly, their blinding light cutting through the darkness of Clarice's mind. The questions screamed by reporters outside her Paris penthouse weren't merely words anymore. They had become a constant hum, a deafening noise that followed her even into the silence of her home. She stood barefoot on the cold marble floor, staring at the muted television screen. Every channel was the same, her face plastered on the news, her name dragged through headlines, her empire dissected piece by piece. Fashion icon or fraud? One anchor had asked the night before. Clarice Moreau implicated in ethical scandal. Workers exploited. Promises broken. She hadn't slept in days. Her team of lawyers and PR experts bombarded her phone with calls, crafting statements she couldn't bear to read. Her closest friends, if they could even be called that, were quick to offer their condolences, carefully laced with the unspoken hope that they wouldn't get dragged down with her. Clarice had built her life like a fortress, brick by brick, with precision and control. She clawed her way to the top of the fashion world, turning her name into a brand synonymous with luxury and power. But this was chaos, and she didn't know how to survive it. The documents had been leaked 3 days ago. Emails, contracts, and reports detailing a side of her company she had ignored for too long. Factories with unsafe conditions, underpaid workers, a supply chain that directly contradicted the sustainable image she had so carefully curated. "I didn't know," she had whispered to her chief of staff when the news broke. But the truth was, deep down, she had known something. She just hadn't asked too many questions. And now, it didn't matter what she knew or didn't know. The world had made up its mind. Outside her window, Paris glittered, indifferent to her unraveling. The city had always been her sanctuary, a reflection of her ambition and elegance. But tonight, it felt like a stranger. She turned away from the view, sinking into the couch as the weight of it all pressed against her chest. The idea came to her in a moment of desperation. She was scrolling aimlessly through old photos on her phone, a futile attempt to escape the reality crashing down around her. One image caught her attention, a snapshot from years ago, taken during a fashion shoot on the coast. The memory rushed back. The small village by the sea, the wooden boats bobbing in the harbor, the salty breeze tangling her hair. It had been so different from the life she knew. For one fleeting moment, she had felt free there. Without overthinking, she grabbed a notebook and jotted down a list. Cash, passport, clothes. Her mind raced. Could she disappear? Just for a while. The thought terrified her, but it also offered something she hadn't felt in days: hope. Clarice moved quickly. She packed a single suitcase with practical clothes she hadn't worn in years, withdrew a significant amount of cash, and turned off her phone for the first time in what felt like forever. She left a note on the marble counter. "Gone for some air. Don't look for me." It was vague enough to buy her time. By the time her private car pulled up to the train station, her heart was pounding in her chest. She wore sunglasses and a plain jacket, blending into the crowd as best as she could. It felt ridiculous. Her, the queen of high fashion, reduced to hiding in plain sight. But the whispers of recognition she dreaded never came. From Paris, she boarded a train south. Her destination, a nameless coastal village she had visited only once but couldn't forget. The journey was long, but for the first time in days, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. No phones, no screens, no judgmental eyes tracking her every move. When she finally arrived, the night had fallen. The village was quiet, the sea murmuring softly in the distance. She stepped off the bus, pulling her small suitcase behind her, and took a deep breath. The air was cool and carried the scent of salt and pine. The square was lit by a few scattered lamps, casting a golden glow over the cobblestone streets. Wooden houses with peeling paint leaned against one another like old friends. This was it, her escape. For the first time in a long while, Clarice felt something stir within her. Not fear, not anxiety, something softer. Relief. But relief was a fragile thing, she reminded herself. Her past wasn't far behind, and sooner or later, it would catch up with her. The bus came to a jerking stop at the edge of a small square. Clarice, clutching the handle of her suitcase, hesitated before stepping off. The village was just as she remembered, quaint and timeless, as though it had been preserved in amber. The sea stretched out in the distance, a vast expanse of shimmering blue, framed by wooden fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. Seagulls cried overhead, their sharp calls blending with the rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore. Clarice took a deep breath, filling her lungs with salty air. It was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stale tension that had consumed her back in Paris. She adjusted her scarf, pulling it higher around her face, and glanced around the square. A handful of locals milled about, their conversations low and unhurried. No one gave her a second look. Her relief was short-lived. She was a stranger here, and she knew that small villages had a way of noticing outsiders. If she wasn't careful, she'd draw exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. Need a place to stay? The voice startled her. She turned to see a middle-aged woman standing a few feet away, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her expression was kind but curious. "Yes," Clarice replied, her voice softer than intended. I was hoping to find somewhere quiet." The woman smiled. "You won't find anywhere quieter than this. I'm Cecilia. I run the only guest house in the village. Come on, I'll show you." Cecilia didn't wait for an answer. She turned and began walking, leaving Clarice no choice but to follow. They wound through narrow cobblestone streets, past houses with weathered shutters and laundry hanging from lines. Clarice kept her head down, listening to the sound of her suitcase wheels clattering over the uneven stones. The guest house was modest, a two-story building with chipped paint and flower boxes overflowing with blooms. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked bread. Cecilia led her to a small room on the upper floor, its window offering a view of the harbor. "It's not much," Cecilia said, gesturing to the simple furnishings. "But it's clean and it's quiet." "It's perfect," Clarice replied, setting her suitcase down by the bed. "Dinner's at 7, Cecilia added. "We eat together in the kitchen. You're welcome to join." Clarice hesitated but nodded. "Thank you." Cecilia lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to ask more about her mysterious guest, but eventually left. Alone, Clarice sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a long, shaky breath. She had made it. For now, at least, she was safe. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet routines. Clarice wandered through the village, familiarizing herself with its rhythm. Mornings were marked by the sound of fishermen preparing their boats and vendors setting up stalls in the square. Afternoons were slower, with locals retreating indoors to escape the midday sun. Evenings brought a soft hum of life as people gathered at the small cafe or along the harbor to watch the sunset. Clarice kept to herself, careful not to draw attention. She introduced herself as Claire, a writer seeking inspiration. It was a lie, of course, but one that felt distant enough from her real life to be believable. Despite her efforts to blend in, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The villagers were polite but wary, their smiles cautious. She noticed the way they glanced at her, as though trying to piece together her story. It was during one of her walks along the harbor that she first met Miguel. He was leaning against a weathered boat, his hands busy repairing a fishing net. His shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing arms tanned and marked by years of labor. His dark hair was windswept, and his expression was one of quiet concentration. Clarice lingered nearby, unsure whether to approach. She wasn't used to starting conversations. Her world had always revolved around people coming to her, seeking her approval or attention. "You need something?" His voice was deep but not unkind. Startled, she realized he had caught her staring. "I was just looking," she said quickly, feeling a flush creep up her neck. "Looking won't teach you much," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You new here?" "Yes," she admitted. "I just arrived a few days ago." "Figured," he said, returning his focus to the net. "This place doesn't get many visitors." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the waves and the occasional cry of a gull. Clarice watched as he worked, his movements precise and deliberate. "Do you fish?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He glanced up at her, amused. "Do I fish? What do you think?" "I mean, do you fish every day?" she clarified, feeling foolish. "Most days," he said. "It's how we live here. No fishing, no food." His words struck her more deeply than she expected. She thought of her old life, where food appeared without thought, where abundance was taken for granted. "Do you want to learn?" Miguel asked, his tone half-teasing. Clarice blinked. "Learn what?" "To fish," he said simply. "I don't think I'd be very good at it," she admitted. Miguel chuckled. "Probably not, but you can watch if you want." Before she could respond, he hoisted the net over his shoulder and walked toward the boat. She hesitated, then followed, curiosity outweighing her hesitation. The first rays of sunlight crept into the small guest-house room, stirring Clarice from a restless sleep. The bed was softer than she'd expected, but her mind refused to rest. She had spent much of the night replaying her brief conversation with Miguel, questioning what had compelled her to follow him toward the docks. When she finally dragged herself out of bed and ventured downstairs, the smell of fresh bread greeted her. Cecilia was bustling around the small kitchen, humming softly to herself as she set out plates. "Good morning," Clarice said hesitantly, still unsure of how to navigate this kind of domestic intimacy. "Morning," Cecilia replied with a warm smile. "Help yourself to some bread and coffee. You'll need it if you're planning to keep up with Miguel today." Clarice blinked. "What?" Cecilia's smile widened. "He told me you'd be out on the water with him. Said something about teaching you the ropes." Clarice hesitated, caught off guard. She hadn't agreed to anything, but as she recalled Miguel's teasing grin and his casual invitation, she realized that refusing might make her stand out even more. The last thing she wanted was for people to start asking too many questions. "I guess I will," she said finally, grabbing a piece of bread. Cecilia laughed. "Good luck." He's not exactly gentle with his lessons. The harbor was alive with activity when Clarice arrived. Boats bobbed in the gentle waves, and the air was filled with the salty tang of the sea. Fishermen called to one another, their voices rough but friendly, as they prepared for the day's work. Miguel stood by his boat, coiling a length of rope with practiced ease. When he spotted her, he gave a small nod. "Didn't think you'd show," he said, his tone light. "I didn't realize I'd agreed to anything," she replied, trying to match his casualness. He smirked. "You didn't. But you're here now, so let's get to it." The boat was smaller than she expected, with peeling paint and well-worn surfaces that spoke of years of use. Miguel moved with confidence, stepping aboard and gesturing for her to follow. Clarice hesitated, unsure of her footing, but eventually climbed in, clutching the edge for balance. The boat rocked gently as they pushed off from the dock, gliding out into the open water. The village grew smaller behind them, its colorful houses fading into the distance. For a moment, Clarice felt a pang of unease. She was used to being surrounded by people, by safety nets. Out here, there was only Miguel and the endless expanse of sea. The first task Miguel assigned her was untangling a fishing net. It looked simple enough, but within minutes, Clarice's hands were aching, and her patience was wearing thin. You're overthinking it, Miguel said, watching her struggle. The net doesn't need you to control it. You just need to follow the knots. Clarice shot him a look. That's easy for you to say. It's easy for me to do, too, he replied with a grin. But everyone starts somewhere. She bit back a retort and focused on the task. The sun climbed higher in the sky as she worked, its warmth mingling with the salty breeze. Eventually, she managed to untangle the net, though her hands were red and raw by the end of it. Miguel examined her work with a critical eye before nodding. Not bad for a first try. Not bad, she repeated, incredulous. Don't let it go to your head, he said, tossing her a bucket. Next job is baiting the lines. By the time they cast the nets into the water, Clarice was exhausted. Her arms ached, her nails were chipped, and she had never felt less glamorous in her life. But as she sat on the edge of the boat, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the water, she realized she didn't mind. There was something oddly satisfying about the simplicity of the work, the way it demanded her full attention. The return to shore was slower, the boat heavier with its modest haul. Miguel didn't say much, letting the hum of the motor and the calls of the seagulls fill the silence. Clarice watched him out of the corner of her eye, noticing the ease with which he moved, the quiet confidence in his every action. You're not used to this kind of work, are you? He asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Clarice stiffened. Is it that obvious? Your hands, he said, nodding toward them. They're too soft. You're not from a place like this. She hesitated, her heart pounding. How much should she reveal? She had been careful to keep her story vague, but Miguel's piercing gaze made her feel exposed. I've spent most of my life in cities, she said finally. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Miguel didn't press her further. Instead, he leaned back, letting the wind ruffle his hair. Cities are overrated. Clarice smiled faintly. You might be right about that. Back on land, Miguel offered to walk her back to the guest house. She declined, needing a moment alone to process the day. As she made her way through the village, she passed a small group of women chatting outside a cafe. They fell silent as she approached, their eyes following her with thinly veiled curiosity. Clarice kept her head high, pretending not to notice, but the weight of their stares lingered long after she had turned the corner. By the time she reached the guest house, her exhaustion had caught up with her. Cecilia greeted her with a knowing smile, setting a plate of stew on the table. How was it? She asked, her tone teasing. Tiring, Clarice admitted, sinking into a chair. Cecilia laughed. Miguel has that effect on people, but he's good at what he does. You'll learn a lot if you stick with him. Clarice nodded, though she wasn't sure what she hoped to learn. She only knew that today had been different, refreshingly, challengingly different. For the first time in years, she had done something entirely unrelated to the life she had built. And for the first time, she didn't feel like Clarice Moreau, the woman the world was so desperate to judge. She simply felt like Claire. The sun was already high when Clarice stepped out of the guest house, a light breeze carrying the faint scent of salt water and wildflowers. Her muscles ached from the previous day's labor with Miguel, but it wasn't an unpleasant ache. It was a reminder that she'd done something real, something that demanded effort and presence. As she made her way toward the harbor, she noticed a subtle change in how people looked at her. Their expressions were less wary, their smiles more open. Even the group of women she'd passed the day before gave her a polite nod instead of the cold silence. Perhaps, she thought, it was Miguel's influence. His quiet acceptance of her presence had given others permission to soften. Or perhaps it was her own shift, her willingness to participate in their world rather than simply observe it. Miguel greeted her at the boat with his usual half-smile, a knowing look in his eyes. Ready to do it all over again? Clarice groaned dramatically, making him chuckle. I'm not sure my hands are, she said, holding them up to show the faint blisters forming along her palms. You'll toughen up, he replied, handing her a pair of gloves. Here, this should help. The day's work followed a similar rhythm to the last, but this time, Clarice felt a bit more confident. She didn't fumble with the nets as much, and she baited the lines with a little less hesitation. Miguel's instructions were brief and straightforward, and though he didn't lavish her with praise, his occasional nods of approval were enough to keep her motivated. By midday, they paused for a break, sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and salted fish. They sat side by side on the edge of the boat, their legs dangling over the water. "You're getting better," Miguel said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Thanks," Clarice replied, surprised by how much the small compliment meant to her. He glanced at her, his expression curious. "Why are you really here, Claire?" The question caught her off guard, though she supposed she should have expected it. Miguel wasn't the type to pry, but he was observant, and her vague answers must have only fueled his curiosity. "I told you," she said carefully. "I'm a writer. I needed a change of scenery." Miguel raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Maybe, but you don't talk like a writer." "How does a writer talk?" she asked, deflecting with a faint smile. "More words. Fancier ones," he said with a shrug. "You're more direct, like someone who's used to being in charge." Her chest tightened at the observation. He was too perceptive. She needed to steer the conversation away from herself before he got too close to the truth. "What about you?" she asked, turning the question around. "Have you always been a fisherman?" Miguel seemed surprised by the shift, but didn't hesitate to answer. "Pretty much. My father was a fisherman, and his father before him. It's what we do here. It's not glamorous, but it's honest." Honest. The word hit her like a stone. How long had it been since she described anything in her life as honest? That evening, after returning to shore, Clarice stopped by the market to pick up some fruit. The vendors greeted her warmly, and she found herself lingering longer than she intended, chatting with a few of them about the catch of the day and the weather. By the time she arrived back at the guest house, Cecilia was waiting for her in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough for the next day's bread. "You're making friends," Cecilia said without looking up. "I guess I am," Clarice replied, sitting at the small wooden table. Cecilia smiled knowingly. "It's a good thing. People around here don't trust easily, but once they do, they'll stand by you no matter what." Clarice nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the women at the cafe and the warmth in Miguel's voice when he'd said she was improving. For years, her relationships had been transactional, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine connection. This was different. This felt real. As she helped Cecilia slice vegetables for dinner, Clarice realized she didn't miss the constant buzz of her old life. The emails, the meetings, the endless parade of faces she barely knew. All of it felt so far away, like a story she had read about someone else. The next morning, she returned to the harbor with Miguel, ready for another day of work. As they prepared the boat, a new voice called out to them. "Claire." She turned to see one of the market vendors, a stout man named Carlos, waving at her. "You left your bag at my stall yesterday," he said, holding up a small cloth bag. Clarice walked over, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "Thank you. I didn't even realize." "No problem," Carlos said with a grin. "You're one of us now. We look out for each other." His words warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. She returned to the boat with a small smile, and when Miguel raised an eyebrow at her, she simply said, "I guess I'm becoming part of the team." Miguel chuckled. "Don't let it go to your head." But the truth was, it did. Just a little. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in hues of gold and orange, Clarice sat on the harbor wall, watching the boats come in. The air was cool, the gentle breeze carrying the sound of laughter and conversation from the nearby cafe. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to contentment. The people here didn't know her as Clarice Moreau, the disgraced fashion mogul. They knew her as Claire, the awkward outsider learning to fish and leaving her bags behind at market stalls. And for now, that was enough. Clarice had begun to feel like she was slipping into the rhythms of the village, her days filled with the simple, honest routines of fishing, chatting with locals, and helping Cecilia around the guest house. The once sharp edges of her former life, glamour, pressure, and judgment, seemed to blur into the background, distant but still faintly present, like a forgotten tune. It was during one of these quieter days that the illusion began to crack. The morning started like any other. The sun was warm but not yet scorching, and the harbor buzzed with activity as the boats set out for their daily trips. Clarice had taken to arriving early, not because she had to, but because she enjoyed the peaceful moments before the work began. Miguel was already there, securing the nets and muttering something about a storm on the horizon. "You're late," he teased, without looking up. "I'm 5 minutes early," she shot back, smirking as she hopped onto the boat. As they pulled away from the dock, Miguel pointed to the sky, where gray clouds gathered faintly on the horizon. "We'll need to be quick today. Storms like this don't wait for anyone." The day's work was intense but satisfying, with Clarice growing more adept at her tasks. She had started to anticipate Miguel's instructions, her movements quicker and more confident. By the time they returned to the harbor in the early afternoon, her clothes were damp, her hands sore, but her spirits high. She and Miguel unloaded the catch together, exchanging the occasional joke with passing villagers. For a brief moment, she felt like she belonged. The trouble began later that afternoon as she wandered through the market to pick up a few things for Cecilia. She paused at a small stall selling flowers, drawn to the vibrant bursts of color. "They're lovely, aren't they?" the vendor said, a middle-aged woman with an easy smile. Clarice nodded, reaching out to touch a delicate white bloom. "They are. I'll take a small bouquet, please." The vendor began wrapping the flowers, but her smile faltered slightly as her eyes flicked over Clarice's face. "You know," the woman said hesitantly. "You remind me of someone. I can't quite place it, but you look familiar." Clarice's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile. "I suppose I just have one of those faces." The vendor chuckled, handing her the bouquet. "Maybe. Still, I swear I've seen you somewhere before." Clarice paid quickly and left, her pulse quickening. She kept her head down as she moved through the market, suddenly hyper-aware of the eyes around her. Back at the guest house, she paced her room, clutching the bouquet as though it could ground her. The vendor's words echoed in her mind. Familiar. Was it just an innocent comment, or had the woman truly recognized her? She had been so careful, keeping her head low and her story vague. But perhaps it wasn't enough. The world she had left behind wasn't kind to secrets, and the people in it had a way of finding what they wanted to know. That evening, during dinner, she noticed Cecilia watching her closely. The older woman had always been perceptive, but tonight her gaze felt sharper, as though she sensed Clarice's unease. "Everything all right?" Cecilia asked, her tone light but probing. "Of course," Clarice replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Cecilia didn't press further, but Clarice could tell she wasn't convinced. The next morning, the unease lingered as Clarice made her way to the harbor. The gray clouds Miguel had warned about had thickened, casting a heavy gloom over the village. "You're quiet today," Miguel said as they prepared the boat. "Just tired," she murmured, echoing her excuse to Cecilia. Miguel studied her for a moment, but didn't push. They worked in relative silence, the usual camaraderie replaced by a tension Clarice couldn't quite shake. As they returned to shore in the late afternoon, the storm finally broke. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking them as they secured the boat and hauled the catch onto the dock. By the time they finished, they were drenched and breathless. "Come on," Miguel said, gesturing toward a nearby cafe. "You'll catch your death out here." Clarice hesitated. She rarely lingered in public spaces, preferring the safety of the guest house. But Miguel's expression left no room for argument, and she followed him inside. The cafe was warm and dimly lit, filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of cups. Miguel ordered 2 coffees and slid one across the table to her. "You're distracted," he said bluntly, leaning back in his chair. I'm fine, she replied, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Liar. Clarice looked up sharply, meeting his steady gaze. Miguel had a way of cutting through her defenses, and she hated how exposed it made her feel. It's nothing, she said finally, her voice quieter. Just someone at the market thought they recognized me. It threw me off, that's all. Miguel raised an eyebrow. Recognized you? From where? She hesitated. I don't know. They didn't say. Miguel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. Claire, if you're running from something, you need to tell me. This place doesn't keep secrets for long. Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden herself of the weight she had been carrying. But the risk was too great. I'm not running, she said, forcing the words out. I'm just starting over. Miguel didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Starting over, huh? Well, you picked the right place for that. Just don't expect it to be easy. I don't, she replied, her voice steady. They finished their coffee in silence, the storm raging outside. The next day, Clarice woke to find the village buzzing with activity. Someone had posted a photo online. A blurry shot of her at the market, her face partially obscured but still recognizable to anyone who looked closely enough. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The vendor must have snapped the picture, either out of curiosity or suspicion. Whatever the reason, the damage was done. By mid-morning, strangers had begun appearing in the square, their cameras and curious glances cutting through the village's usual tranquility. Clarice stayed inside the guest house, her heart pounding with every knock at the door. Cecilia found her in the kitchen, pacing anxiously. What's going on? The older woman asked, her voice laced with concern. Clarice swallowed hard. I think someone recognized me, and now people are looking for me. Cecilia's brow furrowed. Why, who are you? Clarice hesitated. The words caught in her throat. She had known this moment would come eventually, but now that it was here, she wasn't ready. I'll explain everything, she said finally. But not now. Please just trust me. Cecilia nodded slowly, her expression wary but understanding. You need to be careful, she said. This village doesn't like trouble. Clarice nodded, her chest tightening. Trouble had found her, whether she liked it or not. The first knock came just after sunrise. Clarice sat frozen at the small wooden table in Cecilia's kitchen, her hands gripping a half-empty mug of coffee. Cecilia, who had been chopping vegetables for the morning stew, set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. Stay here, she said firmly, her voice low. Clarice nodded, her heart pounding as Cecilia walked to the door. The sound of it creaking open sent a chill down her spine. Can I help you? Cecilia's tone was sharp but polite. We're looking for someone, a man's voice replied. A woman. We think she might be staying here. Clarice's stomach churned. She didn't need to see him to know who he was. Paparazzi didn't usually announce themselves, but when they came this far for a story, they rarely left without one. I don't know what you're talking about, Cecilia said smoothly. This is a quiet village. No one here fits that description. There was a pause, followed by the sound of shuffling feet. We're just asking around, the man persisted. If you see her... Cecilia cut him off, her tone sharp. I'll be sure to let you know. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. The door closed firmly, and Cecilia returned to the kitchen, her expression unreadable. They're not going away, she said, her voice low. Who are they? And who are you? Clarice stared at her mug, the weight of Cecilia's question pressing down on her. She had spent weeks pretending to be someone else, weaving half-truths to keep her old life at bay. But now, the facade was crumbling, and there was no escaping the truth. I'm not who I said I was, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Cecilia crossed her arms, waiting. My name is Clarice Moreau, she continued, the words feeling heavy and foreign on her tongue. I used to run a fashion empire, but there was a scandal. Things fell apart, and I needed to get away. Cecilia's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. And you came here? To hide. Clarice nodded, her throat tight. I didn't mean to bring trouble. I just needed peace. A chance to figure out who I am without all of that. Cecilia was silent for a long moment, her gaze steady and unflinching. Then, with a small sigh, she turned back to the counter and picked up her knife. Well, she said, slicing through a carrot with precise movements, you've certainly made things interesting around here. Clarice blinked, caught off guard by the lack of anger in Cecilia's tone. You're not upset? Oh, I'm upset, Cecilia replied without looking up. But not for the reasons you think. Those vultures out there, she nodded toward the door. They'll tear this place apart if you're not careful. And we don't need that kind of attention. I'll leave, Clarice said quickly. I don't want to cause any more problems. Cecilia shook her head. Running won't fix this. You need to face it. Later that day, Clarice ventured out for the first time since the knock at the door. She kept her head low, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck, but the stares were impossible to ignore. The villagers were used to outsiders, but not the kind with cameras and probing questions. At the harbor, Miguel was waiting by his boat, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. You've been busy, he said as she approached. Clarice hesitated, unsure how much he knew. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Miguel let out a dry laugh. That much is obvious, but you should have told me the truth. I couldn't, she said, her voice trembling. If I had, you wouldn't have let me stay. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes piercing. Maybe not, but lying didn't help, did it? She lowered her gaze, unable to argue. Miguel sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Look, I don't care who you are or what you've done, but these people, he gestured toward the village. They do. You've earned their trust, and now it's on the line. What should I do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Be honest, he said simply, and hope it's enough. That evening, the village square was quieter than usual, the tension palpable. Clarice stood on the small balcony outside her room, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The words Miguel had said earlier echoed in her mind. Be honest. It sounded so simple, but the thought of exposing herself, of admitting her failures, terrified her. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Cecilia stood in the doorway, holding a steaming cup of tea. You look like you could use this, she said, setting the cup down on the small table. Thank you, Clarice murmured. Cecilia lingered, her expression softening. This village is a good place, Clarice. She corrected herself. But it's fragile. People here don't trust easily, and when they do, it means something. I know, Clarice said. I never wanted to break that trust. Then don't, Cecilia replied. You've already done more good here than you realize. Don't let this undo it. The next morning, Clarice made her way to the harbor, her steps heavy but determined. Miguel was already there, repairing one of his nets. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. I need your help, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. With what? Fixing this, she replied. I don't know how, but I can't do it alone. Miguel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, let's start with the truth. Together, they walked back toward the village square, where a small crowd had begun to gather. The whispers grew louder as they approached, and Clarice felt the weight of every gaze. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. There's something you all need to know, she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs. My name is Clarice Moreau, and I haven't been honest with you. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. As the villagers listened, she told them her story. Not just a scandal, but the mistake she had made, the reason she had come here, and the hope she had found in their quiet, simple lives. When she finished, the square was silent. Miguel stood at her side, his presence a quiet reassurance. Finally, one of the older fishermen stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. "Well," he said gruffly, "you're a fool for thinking you could hide here, but you're our fool now." A ripple of laughter spread to the crowd, breaking the tension. Clarice felt a wave of relief, her chest loosening for the first time in days. Miguel leaned close, his voice low. "Told you honesty works." She smiled faintly, her gaze sweeping over the villagers. For better or worse, she was no longer hiding. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The aftermath of Clarice's confession lingered in the village like the salt-heavy breeze that refused to dissipate after a storm. The villagers had listened to her story with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and quiet understanding. While some had warmed to her openness, others remained wary, their trust not so easily won back. Clarice spent the next few days trying to keep her head down, even as she felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation in the market. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing by telling the truth, but the nagging doubt in her chest told her otherwise. Miguel, however, remained a steady presence. He didn't offer flowery reassurances or make promises he couldn't keep, but his silent support was enough to keep her grounded. "You did what you had to do," he told her one evening as they sat by the harbor, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Now it's up to them to decide what to do with it." "I just hope I didn't make things worse," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Miguel's gaze was steady, his tone firm. "The truth has a way of settling things, even if it takes time." The tension escalated when more strangers arrived in the village, their cameras and invasive questions disrupting the delicate peace Clarice had fought so hard to protect. Paparazzi were not subtle, and the once quiet streets of the village began to buzz with their unwelcome presence. At first, they lingered on the edges, hoping for a glimpse of Clarice without causing too much of a stir. But as the days passed and she refused to engage with them, their tactics grew bolder. They knocked on doors, questioned villagers, and even set up near the harbor, hoping to catch her during her daily routine. For the villagers, it was more than a nuisance. Their privacy was sacred, and the sudden intrusion threatened the sense of safety they had cultivated over generations. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, and Clarice found herself at the center of the storm. One afternoon, as she walked through the market, a sharp voice cut through the air. "This is your fault." Clarice turned to see an older woman, her face lined with years of hard work and sun, glaring at her from across the square. "If you hadn't come here, none of this would be happening," the woman continued, her voice rising. "We don't need your trouble. We were fine before you showed up." The accusation stung, and Clarice felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the square turning toward her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? The woman wasn't wrong. Before she could stumble through an apology, Miguel appeared at her side, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough, Marta. She's not the only one to blame here." Marta's glare shifted to him. "And what do you suggest we do, Miguel? Let them ruin everything we've built?" "They'll leave," Miguel said confidently. "But only if we stop giving them a reason to stay." The tension hung in the air for a moment longer before Marta let out a huff and turned away, muttering under her breath. Miguel glanced at Clarice, his expression softening. "You okay?" She nodded, though her chest felt tight. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But you will be." That evening, Cecilia found her sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at a cup of untouched tea. "You can't keep carrying this on your own," Cecilia said, sitting down across from her. "What choice do I have?" Clarice asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I can't undo what's happened." "No," Cecilia agreed, "but you can face it head on. You're not just hiding anymore, Clarice. You're part of this village now. And if you want to stay, you need to fight for it." Clarice looked up, her brow furrowing. Fight how? Cecilia leaned back in her chair, considering her words. You have resources most of us don't. Influence. Connections. Maybe it's time you use them for something other than running away. The suggestion sat heavily with Clarice, but it planted a seed of resolve she couldn't ignore. The next morning, Clarice met Miguel at the harbor, her jaw set with determination. I need your help, she said without preamble. Miguel raised an eyebrow. With what? Fixing this, she replied. I can't do it alone. Miguel studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, what's the plan? Together, they devised a strategy. Clarice would reach out to a trusted journalist she had worked with in the past, someone who valued integrity over sensationalism. She would offer an exclusive interview, one that would tell her story on her own terms and, more importantly, shift the attention away from the village. It's a risk, Miguel warned. You're putting yourself back in the spotlight. I know, Clarice said, but if it means protecting this place, it's worth it. The interview was arranged quickly, and the journalist, a composed woman named Isabel, arrived in the village 2 days later. Unlike the paparazzi, Isabel was discreet, her demeanor professional and respectful. They met in the cafe, where Clarice recounted her story in full. She didn't shy away from her mistakes or the choices that had led her here. But she also spoke about what she had learned in the village, the importance of community, of honesty, of stepping away from the chaos to rediscover what truly mattered. Isabel listened intently, her pen gliding across her notebook. When the interview was over, she reached across the table and squeezed Clarice's hand. Thank you for trusting me, she said. I'll make sure this is told the right way. The article was published a week later, and its impact was immediate. Isabel's thoughtful portrayal of Clarice's journey struck a chord with readers, and the public's fascination with her began to shift. The paparazzi, realizing they no longer had an exclusive story to chase, gradually disappeared, leaving the village to reclaim its peace. For the villagers, the ordeal had been a reminder of the fragility of their way of life. But as the days passed and things returned to normal, many of them began to soften toward Clarice, recognizing her efforts to make things right. Marta, the woman who had confronted her in the market, approached her one morning as she helped Miguel unload the day's catch. I still don't like all the attention you brought here, Marta said gruffly. Clarice opened her mouth to respond, but Marta held up a hand. But I respect what you did to fix it. You've earned your place here. The words, though terse, carried a weight that Clarice didn't take lightly. That evening, she and Miguel sat on the harbor wall, watching the sun set over the water. You did good, Miguel said, his voice warm. Clarice smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. We did good. Miguel glanced at her, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Don't let it go to your head. She laughed, the sound carrying over the waves. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. The village felt quieter in the days following the publication of Isabel's article. The persistent hum of tension that had hung in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by the usual rhythm of fishing boats, market chatter, and the distant cries of seagulls. For the first time in weeks, Clarice felt like she could breathe. She sat on the small balcony of her room at the guest house, the newspaper spread out on the table before her. Isabel's article had been written with care and thoughtfulness, capturing Clarice's story without sensationalism. The headline read, Finding Solace, A Life Beyond the Spotlight. It detailed her rise in the fashion world, the mistakes she had made, and the reason she had chosen to seek refuge in a small coastal village. But what struck Clarice most was the way Isabel had described the community, their kindness, resilience, and the way they had embraced her despite her flaws. As she read the final lines, Clarice felt a pang of both gratitude and guilt. She owed the villagers more than an apology. She owed them her commitment to making things right. Later that morning, Clarice made her way to the harbor, where Miguel was repairing a section of his boat's railing. He looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag. Morning, he said, his tone casual but warm. Morning, she replied, sitting on a nearby crate. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I wanted to thank you for everything. Miguel raised an eyebrow. Everything? For standing by me, she said, even when I didn't deserve it. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're stubborn. I figured someone had to keep you out of trouble. Clarice laughed softly, the sound easing some of the lingering tension between them. Still, I mean it. I wouldn't have gotten through this without you. Miguel leaned back against the railing, studying her. You've come a long way, you know. When you first got here, I didn't think you'd last a week. Neither did I, she admitted, smiling. He nodded toward the village. So, what's next? Clarice took a deep breath, the weight of the question settling over her. I want to give something back, she said. This place has done so much for me. I need to do the same. Miguel tilted his head, curious. What are you thinking? I'm not sure yet, she admitted, but I'll figure it out. Over the next few days, Clarice began to throw herself into the life of the village with renewed purpose. She helped Cecilia at the guest house, offering to clean rooms and prepare meals. She joined the women at the market, learning how to haggle and helping them arrange their stalls. At first, her efforts were met with skepticism. Some villagers still regarded her with caution, unwilling to fully trust someone who had brought so much upheaval to their lives. But slowly, her persistence began to pay off. One afternoon, she offered to help Carlos, the fish vendor, repair a broken display table, though he initially waved her off, muttering something about city hands. He eventually relented. By the time the table was fixed, Carlos gave her a grudging nod of approval. You're not as useless as you look, he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. Clarice laughed, taking the comment as the compliment it was meant to be. As the days turned into weeks, the villagers' attitudes toward her continued to soften. Marta, the woman who had publicly chastised her in the market, even began to greet her with a curt nod instead of a glare. Cecilia noticed a shift too, and one evening as they prepared dinner together, she smiled knowingly at Clarice. They're starting to see you for who you are, Cecilia said, handing her a basket of vegetables to chop. Clarice hesitated, her knife hovering over a tomato. And who is that? Someone who's trying, Cecilia replied simply. That's enough. The word stayed with her long after dinner was over. One morning, as she walked along the beach collecting driftwood, Clarice found herself thinking about her old life. The designer clothes, the towering office building, the constant stream of meetings and events. It all felt like a distant memory, a dream that belonged to someone else. And yet, there was one part of that life she couldn't ignore. The skills she had gained, the knowledge she carried. For all its flaws, her career had taught her how to build something from the ground up, how to create and sustain. An idea began to take shape in her mind. That evening, she shared her thoughts with Miguel as they sat on the harbor wall, watching the boats return with their day's catch. I want to start something here, she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and hesitation. Miguel glanced at her, curious. Start what? A small business, she explained. Something sustainable, something that gives back to the village. Maybe a shop that sells locally made goods, fish, crafts, produce. Something that puts this place on the map in a good way. Miguel considered her words, his brow furrowed. You think people here will go for it? I don't know, she admitted, but it's worth a try. This village deserves more than just being a footnote in my story. It deserves to shine on its own. Miguel's expression softened, and he gave her a small nod. If anyone can pull it off, it's you. Clarice spent the next few weeks working tirelessly to bring her idea to life. She met with villagers, listening to their concerns and suggestions. She enlisted Miguel's help to renovate an old storage building near the harbor, transforming it into a cozy shop space. Cecilia pitched in as well, helping Clarice network with local artisans and suppliers. Together, they curated a selection of goods that showcased the best of what the village had to offer. When the shop finally opened, the entire village turned out to celebrate. The air was filled with laughter and music, the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the salty breeze. For Clarice, it was more than just a business. It was a symbol of her transformation, a testament to the strength and resilience of the community that had taken her in. As she stood outside the shop, watching the villagers mingle and laugh, Miguel appeared at her side. "Looks like you did it," he said, his tone warm. "We did it," she corrected, smiling up at him. Miguel chuckled, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "So, what's next?" Clarice laughed softly, her heart full for the first time in years. "I think I'll just enjoy this for a while." The village's shop had been open for nearly a month, and the transformation it brought was palpable. For years, the community had relied on fishing and seasonal tourism to sustain itself. But the shop gave them something more, a sense of pride. Locals wandered in daily, admiring the shelves stocked with their handiwork. Intricately woven baskets, jars of preserved fruits, freshly caught fish, and hand-carved trinkets. Clarice stood behind the counter one morning, carefully arranging a display of seashell necklaces crafted by a local teenager named Elena. The young girl had shyly brought them in a week earlier, her hands trembling as she showed Clarice her work. "They're beautiful," Clarice had told her. "Let's give them a place of honor." Now, as customers browsed the shop, Clarice caught sight of Elena peeking in through the window, her face lighting up as she saw someone admiring one of her necklaces. It was a small moment, but it filled Clarice with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The village had accepted her in a way she never thought possible. Where once there had been suspicion, there was now warmth. Marta, the woman who had so openly criticized her, stopped by the shop regularly to buy goods and gossip. Carlos, the fish vendor, dropped off the freshest catches with a gruff nod that now felt more like an unspoken friendship. And then there was Miguel. Their friendship had deepened in ways Clarice hadn't anticipated. He had a way of grounding her, pulling her back to the present when her mind wandered to doubts or insecurities. They still teased each other relentlessly, but there was an ease between them now, a rhythm that felt natural. "You've changed," he said one evening as they sat by the harbor, the fading sunlight painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Clarice glanced at him, curious. "How so?" "You're not running anymore," he said simply. The word struck her, and she realized he was right. For months, she had been running from her mistakes, her fears, her identity. But now, for the first time in years, she felt steady. Her newfound stability, however, came with a sense of responsibility. While the shop was thriving, Clarice knew it wasn't enough to fully sustain the village in the long term. The villagers had dreams and ambitions that went beyond their quiet corner of the world, and she wanted to help them achieve those dreams. One evening, as Cecilia served dinner at the guest house, Clarice shared her thoughts. "We could expand," she said, her excitement bubbling over. "Not just a shop, but the idea behind it. A brand that represents the village. Something sustainable, something that tells a story." Cecilia raised an eyebrow, setting a bowl of stew in front of her. "A brand?" "Yes," Clarice said, leaning forward. "We could sell online, reach people who want something authentic. Everything here has a story. Marta's woven baskets, Carlos's smoked fish, even Elena's necklaces. People would love it." Cecilia considered this, a thoughtful look on her face. "And you think we can pull this off?" "I know we can," Clarice said, her confidence unwavering. Miguel, who had been listening quietly from across the table, finally spoke. "It's ambitious," he said, "but you've pulled off crazier things." Clarice grinned at him. "Is that your way of saying you'll help?" He smirked. "I didn't say that." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and organizing. Clarice worked closely with the villagers, helping them refine their crafts and create cohesive branding. She enlisted Elena to help design a logo, a simple yet elegant depiction of the village's harbor, framed by waves. Miguel, despite his initial hesitation, became one of her biggest supporters. He handled the logistics, helping her source packaging materials and coordinate shipments. His practical mindset balanced her creative energy, and together, they built something that felt both innovative and deeply rooted in the village's traditions. The first few online orders trickled in slowly, but as word spread, the numbers grew. Clarice watched with a mix of pride and disbelief as the villagers began to realize the potential of what they had created. One evening, as they closed the shop, Miguel turned to her with a rare, genuine smile. "You're good at this," he said. Clarice tilted her head, teasing. "At what?" "Building something out of nothing," he said simply. Her smile softened. "I had a lot of help." Miguel nodded, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a faint chuckle, he added, "Just don't let it go to your head." As the village's small brand continued to grow, Clarice found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The woman who had arrived here months ago, broken, desperate, and hiding, felt like a stranger now. She had rediscovered parts of herself she thought she'd lost. Her creativity, her resilience, her ability to connect with others. But she had also found something new, a sense of belonging that no amount of fame or fortune could replicate. The villagers no longer looked at her as an outsider. She was one of them now, and the thought filled her with a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. One night, as she sat on the harbor wall with Miguel, the sound of the waves lapping against the shore, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked. Miguel shrugged. "Not much. I take things one day at a time." Clarice smiled faintly. "I used to plan everything, every detail of my life. And now, I don't know. It feels good not to have all the answers." Miguel glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "That's a dangerous thing to admit. Someone might hold it against you." She laughed softly, the sound carrying over the water. "Let them try." For the first time in a long while, Clarice felt at peace. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, this was enough. The first signs of summer arrived in the village with the scent of blooming wildflowers and the laughter of children playing near the harbor. The skies stretched wide and blue, dotted with seagulls gliding lazily over the water. Clarice stood outside the shop, her hands on her hips as she watched the villagers bustling about, their movements carrying the ease of a life lived in harmony with the sea. The shop had become more than just a place to sell goods. It was a hub of activity, a space where people gathered to share stories and celebrate small victories. That morning, Marta had dropped off a batch of woven baskets with intricate designs that told stories of the village's history. Elena, now more confident in her craft, had set up a small workspace in one corner of the shop to take custom orders for her seashell necklaces. As Clarice stepped inside, her heart swelled with pride. She had once been consumed by the relentless pursuit of success, but this felt different. This wasn't about her. It was about the community she had come to love. Later that afternoon, she joined Cecilia in the guest house kitchen, helping prepare a feast for the evening's celebration. The villagers had decided to throw a party to mark the shop's success and the start of the summer season, a way to thank Clarice and celebrate their collective achievements. "Do you ever miss it?" Cecilia asked as she sliced a loaf of bread. "Miss what?" Clarice replied, stirring a pot of stew. "Your old life, the spotlight, the glamour." Clarice paused, considering the question. "I thought I would," she admitted, "but the truth is I don't. That life, it felt like I was always running, always chasing something I couldn't name. Here, I feel like I found what I was looking for." Cecilia smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, it takes losing everything to figure out what really matters." Clarice nodded, her gaze softening. "I just wish I'd realized it sooner." By sunset, the square was alive with music and laughter. Tables were laden with food, and lanterns hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Clarice moved through the crowd, exchanging smiles and greetings with the villagers. Marta waved her over, handing her a glass of wine. "You did good, city girl," she said gruffly, though her tone carried a note of affection. "Thanks, Marta," Clarice replied with a grin. That means a lot coming from you. Carlos, standing nearby, raised his glass in a mock toast. To Clarice, the woman who turned our quiet village upside down. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Clarice felt her cheeks flush. I'd like to think I turned it right side up, she said, earning another round of laughter. As the evening wore on, Clarice found herself standing at the edge of the square, watching the festivities from a distance. The sight filled her with a deep sense of contentment. This wasn't just a new chapter in her life. It was a whole new book, one she was excited to keep writing. Miguel joined her, holding 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to her, his gaze following hers to the crowd. Not bad for a girl from the city, he said, his tone teasing but warm. Not bad at all, she replied, smiling. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Miguel spoke again. You ever think about what's next? Clarice tilted her head, considering the question. I think, for the first time, I'm not in a rush to figure it out. I like where I am right now. Miguel nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Good. You deserve that. She looked at him, her chest tightening with gratitude. You've been a big part of that, you know. Miguel chuckled softly, his gaze steady. You didn't need me. You just needed someone to remind you what you were capable of. Clarice felt a warmth spread through her, the words settling deep in her chest. Well, thank you for everything. Miguel raised his glass. To what's next? Clarice clinked her glass against his, a smile breaking across her face. To what's next? As the night wound down, Clarice found herself sitting by the harbor, the village quieting around her. The lanterns in the square still glowed faintly, their light reflecting off the water. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the mistakes, the losses, the lessons she had learned along the way. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The woman she had been before, Clarice Moreau, the untouchable fashion mogul, felt like a distant memory. In her place was someone new, someone she was proud to be. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Cecilia approaching. Thought I might find you here, Cecilia said, sitting beside her. Clarice smiled. It's my favorite spot. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Finally, Cecilia spoke. You've done something special here, Clarice. Don't forget that. Clarice nodded, her heart full. Neither will I. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.